to understand whether this is a serious moment for peace, which John Healey said is what everyone wants. All wars, he said, end in diplomacy, very poignantly on VJ Day, but they wait to see whether there is a realistic chance of it.
Tamara, thank you. Let's take you live to Joint Base Andrews. We've got those pictures there on the tarmac, as you can see, the President's motorcade arriving at the airbase. 7:55 a.m. United States Eastern Time, 12:55 in the UK. As President Donald Trump arrives to depart for that 7-hour journey to Alaska, alongside a significant group of people travelling with him, according to a White House official, Secretary Marco Rubio, interestingly, Treasury Secretary, Commerce Secretary Scott Bessent and Howard Lutnick, Caroline Leavitt, his press secretary, of course. That's what makes it a long motorcade. David Blevins joins us live from Washington, D.C. David, a significant moment for President Trump's presidency. He promised he would bring an end to the war in Ukraine. That may not be happening today, but at least a significant step. And also the first significant meeting between a US president and a president of Russia for many years.
A day of enormous symbolism as Donald J. Trump arrives at Joint Base Andrews. It could be the most significant day of his presidency so far. He's made the 10-mile journey southeast of Washington to Joint Base Andrews, where he is now boarding Air Force One for the 7-hour flight to Anchorage, Alaska, where he will come face to face with his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin for the first time in 6 years. So a wave from the president as he boards the plane. He is joined by a significant delegation today, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, also his special envoy Steve Witkoff, who's really been the go-between with Vladimir Putin for some time now. Also travelling with the President, his Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, his Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. That tells us that economic issues are going to be on the table. Also on board, Susie Wiles, the President's Chief of Staff. Some people describe her as the Trump whisperer, the person who has most ability to influence him. He himself describes her as the most powerful woman in the world. Caroline Leavitt is travelling too. She is the President's press secretary, familiar to many people from her regular press briefings at the White House. And that would suggest that there is at least a provision for a joint press conference after the two leaders have met. But it would be difficult, if not impossible, to exaggerate the significance of this moment. It is the first time in 4 years that a US president has come face to face with a Russian president. The last meeting was with President Biden, and that was before the war even began in Ukraine. The first time in 6 years that Trump has met Putin, and the first time in 10 years that a Russian president has set foot on US soil. So it's not a great surprise to us, really, that the first thing the president did this morning when he wakened at the White House was post on his Truth Social platform just 2 words in capital letters: high stakes, with 3 exclamation marks. That is absolutely the case, that it is a day of high stakes, because Donald Trump hopes this might be the beginning of the end of the war in Ukraine.
A very good afternoon, David. It is Darren here, turning 1 o'clock in the UK. I suppose my question to you is, as we await Air Force One to take off from Maryland on its way to Alaska, is that, yes, there is a lot of politics involved, but my word, a lot of this will boil down to that relationship, that personal rapport between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump.
That is absolutely right, Darren. A lot of conversation around Trump's hope that he might be able to broker a ceasefire that would pave the way to a potential trilateral summit where Presidents Putin and Zelensky could discuss territory. A lot of focus on the rumour that Donald Trump's going to offer Vladimir Putin an opportunity to invest, if you like, in US territory to perhaps mine for rare earth minerals in that area of the United States, Alaska, which is rich in resource and where they've got a vested interest economically. But beyond all of that, there is so much symbolism in the fact that a Russian president is arriving back on US soil, that it happens to be in Alaska, where the two countries almost meet on the map, that it happens to be in Alaska, a part of the United States that was once owned by Russia until they sold it to the Americans to pay the costs really of the Crimea War. And there's going to be a lot of focus on things like the foreign minister of Russia arriving wearing a sweatshirt with USSR or the equivalent of it on the front, and the body language, because Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin are similar in many ways. They like to be seen as bold and uncompromising, the strong men of the world. And so there's going to be a lot of focus on body language as well today, and that's before we even get down to the substance of what's actually discussed when the two men meet, not just with their delegations over lunch, but before that, we understand, one-on-one with really just their translators present.
And David, also, we know not just that the world is watching, and my word, European leaders are watching this intensely, clearly also including President Zelensky, but Donald Trump is also thinking of his domestic audience back home too.
Yes, I think it's so important to remember that throughout the election campaign, Donald Trump promised that he would bring this war to an end within 24 hours, and 200 plus days into his presidency, the war rages on in Ukraine, more violence overnight in the run-up to this summit. So his own audience at home are watching, and of course he wants them to see him as the peacemaker. He styles himself as peacemaker in chief. As the engines really begin to roar on Air Force One as they prepare for depart, it's important, I think, to remember how much effort he has focused on peacemaking in recent months. He claims to have brought to an end 5 or 6 different wars, including the 12-day war between Israel and Iran, the war between India and Pakistan, the conflict between Cambodia and Thailand, the conflict between Rwanda and the Congo, to name just a few. And even just last Friday, he brokered a historic peace deal between Azerbaijan and Armenia, countries that have been at war for 4 decades. And it was at that press conference announcing that historic deal, he confirmed that this historic flight would take place, that he would make the journey to Anchorage in Alaska to come face to face with Vladimir Putin at the request of the Russians. Now, this has happened in a remarkably short space of time. They've had to put this summit together in just 7 days, and I think we see some of the fluidity behind the scenes in the negotiations, some of the frantic efforts to make the preparations in the fact that Donald Trump's position has been so changeable. He's gone from a position of telling us last Friday that he envisaged a deal that would involve land swapping. That raised many eyebrows, and I suppose it is what has triggered the round of negotiations between European leaders with Vladimir Zelensky. He then on Monday scaled this all back and said, well, I'm just going on a feel-out mission. Caroline Levitt, his press secretary, telling us that it would be just a fact-finding exercise, a listening exercise. And then yesterday, the president ramped things up again by telling us that he believed Vladimir Putin would do a deal with him today. Well, he's about to depart from Joint Base Andrews on this historic mission to meet with Vladimir Putin. So let's see how this day finishes.
Indeed, it could be a very long day indeed as Air Force One taxis to the runway. David, for the moment, thank you. Let's bring in Michael Clark, a security and defence analyst. Michael, just to pick up on what David was talking about there. What's your sense of what's going to go on today? Is it that this is essentially Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump getting together for the first time in 6 years, trying to feel each other out, if you like? Or is there actually going to be substantial detail on the table in terms of actual real negotiations about trying to bring this war to an end?
Well, Darren, what I think will happen is it'll be two sorts of meetings at two sorts of levels. So at the one level, it's a one-to-one between Trump and Putin with just interpreters present, apparently nobody else. And that will be a sort of a meeting of atmosphere. And undoubtedly, Putin will try to convince Trump that they do have a lot in common and that they just need to set aside the Ukraine problem so they can get on with other things. And that is the meeting that everyone will focus on, where the dynamics, the chemistry between these two men, who are very similar in so many ways, actually, that will be sort of played through. But then the other meeting is the one that will go on between the two teams. And that will be a meeting about economic relationships. And it may deal with other things, such as arms control. It may deal with tariff issues, although there's no particular tariff issue. Well, there's no tariff issue between America and Russia at the moment, because the Americans didn't put any tariffs on Russia. The only country that they excluded from tariffs, even though there's $3.5 billion worth of trade between them. But they will talk undoubtedly about oil prices, about energy. So there's a sort of technical meeting that will go on as well. And how much Ukraine features in that technical meeting, I think, will be the matter that we'll all be interested in. I mean, the world will be fascinated by the personal meeting between the two presidents, but the analysts will be fascinated by the technical meeting that goes on below that level. And I think that's where we'll be looking to see whether anything comes out of this that doesn't sort of fall through our fingers like sand in your hand by the middle of next week.
OK, Michael, thank you for that, as Air Force One is wheels up on its way to Alaska for this historic meeting between President Trump and Vladimir Putin, and indeed wide-scale delegations on both sides. A crucial meeting that might not just decide, of course, the future of Ukraine and its borders, but indeed of the transatlantic relationship between the United States and Russia for years to come. And on that point, David Blevins, who's live for us in Washington this afternoon, that's also key in this, because there is little doubt, isn't there, that the Trump administration views this not just as dealing with a war in Ukraine, but also that relationship and how the United States and Russia may well go forward, not least of all given Russia's mineral reserves and their access to oil.
Yeah, the beginning of a long flight for President Trump and his delegation. 7 hours it will take them to reach Anchorage in Alaska, but he believes that it will be, or at least hopes it will be, the beginning of the end of a long war in Ukraine. And it's going to be a day so heavy on symbolism, but also a day when there is so much substance. It is notable, Darren, that he has brought with him his Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, and his Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, because that tells us that there is going to be a discussion around economic issues. There has been lots of speculation in recent days that Trump will offer Putin some kind of access to minerals in that Alaska region in return for a ceasefire. That may well be on the table today. But I think the crunch meeting is going to be when Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin meet one-to-one, not with their delegations present, just translators present. That's when the serious business is going to be done today, and to be a fly on the wall for that meeting.
Yeah, a fly on the wall indeed. Michael, if you are still there, if we don't have access to Michael Clark, I wanted to speak to him about what the details of the deal might be. David, I will put that to you instead. It's quite difficult, isn't it? And it's going to be incredibly complex. One of the reasons why almost certainly we won't see an actual substantive deal today is this idea of what happens to the territory that Russia already occupies.
Yeah, well, when Donald Trump talks about a deal, it's a bit confusing because on one hand he says, I think Vladimir Putin will make a deal, then says there's a 25% chance the meeting will end in failure. And then a few days ago he told us it wasn't his job to make the deal, that the deal has to be done between Russia and Ukraine. So I think what he's really saying is that he hopes to get as far as securing a ceasefire, and then Putin and Zelensky at a future meeting potentially could get into the serious business, the more substantive business of territory. But they are poles apart on that because the Russians continue to advance right up until yesterday in Ukraine, and they're not in the business of surrendering territory they have fought hard for. In fact, we are told, and Michael Clark's in a much better position to talk about this than me, that Putin wants actually all of the Donbass region to the east. But Vladimir Zelensky has made it clear that he's not going to surrender that. He says he doesn't have a constitutional authority to do that, but also to do so would leave Kyiv vulnerable to future offences. It would rob the capital of some of its defence lines. So the trickier business is going to come in due course, even if he gets so far as today as to persuading Vladimir Putin to call a ceasefire. And that's his hope as he heads towards Alaska.
Yeah, it is indeed, David. Little doubt about that. And Michael does now join us. And I don't know if you heard my question to David earlier, Michael, and that's the kind of the detail here, the idea of this of a land swap, what peace, or at least even a ceasefire might look like, is incredibly complex.
Yes, it is. I mean, that realistically, Darren, is what we might be talking about. That's the most we might be talking about, not any sort of legal land swap, but a ceasefire in place is possible, in which troops on both sides agree to withdraw from a ceasefire line. So it's possible, I don't think it's going to happen, but let's say it's possible, that the Russians might withdraw from some of the slivers of territory that they occupy in the north, in Sumy and Kharkiv. It's possible that the Russians might also withdraw from parts of southern Zaporizhia and Kherson, as long as they can keep a land bridge open between the Donbass and Crimea, which is really important to them. But the thing that is most controversial is Putin's demand that the rest of the Donbass be ceded to him, or at least that Ukrainian troops withdraw from the 25% of Donetsk that they still hold. And the point is, it's not just any old 25%. This is the most heavily defended 25% of Donetsk. So if you look at it on a map, there are 4 cities, from Slavyansk through Kramatorsk to Drushkivka and then Konstantinivka. And those are what the Russians themselves call the fortress cities. It's like a strong defensive line, which the Ukrainians have been holding since 2014. They've expended a lot of blood and treasure in order to maintain that line. And Putin, reportedly, has been demanding that the Ukrainians withdraw from that area, from the rest of Donetsk, which will give the Russians the whole of the Donbass. I find it impossible to imagine that would happen. A ceasefire in place where everybody stays in place in the Donbass is possible. I don't think it'll happen, but it's possible. But Zelensky himself has repeatedly this week ruled out the idea that they would withdraw from those fortress cities and move to the west and just let Russian troops move in. I just don't think it would happen. But that seems to be the essence of the original demand that Putin made and that Trump seemed to think was a good idea. Because Steve Witkoff seems to have come back from talking to Putin with a rather hazy idea of what Putin was talking about. He doesn't seem to have understood it terribly well. The European counterparts think genuinely, they're saying it out loud now, that Steve Witkoff is out of his depth. He doesn't really know what he's doing. And he seems to have conveyed the idea to President Trump that there's a deal to be done here, that if the Russians can move into the rest of the Donbass, the Russians might move out of parts of southern Zaporizhia and Kherson, as long as they can keep a corridor. I think that's pie in the sky, but on paper, that is plausible as a result of what may not happen today, but what may be put in process today that might then start to unravel itself, as it were, over the next 2 to 3 weeks towards some sort of ceasefire in place.
OK, Michael, it is undoubtedly complex and equally fascinating as well. Thank you very much for your insight, and indeed to David Blevins, joining us live from Washington, D.C.